What happens when an 89-year-old man, humiliated for asking for a simple sandwich, crosses paths with a powerful woman who uncovers a shocking truth? Stay tuned for a heart-stopping revelation that will change everything. An 89-year-old frail man walked into a cafe and simply asked for a sandwich. He was treated with disdain and humiliated, but among the customers, a wealthy woman was watching the scene closely. Her eyes fixated on something on his wrist, and suddenly she froze. With her heart racing, she approached him, and when she saw what it really was, her face went pale. The gentle aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the low buzz of customers in the busy cafe. It was an ordinary day, but a strange silence fell over the place when the door opened, revealing an elderly man. His steps were slow, almost dragging, as he crossed the threshold. Old Giuseppe, at 89, was visibly worn out by life. His thin, stooped body carried not only the weight of age but also years of suffering. His tattered, faded clothes barely protected him from the biting cold of the day, and his shoes, nearly soleless, showed his toes. He made his way through the room with trembling hands, ignoring the disapproving stares of the customers. He passed through the discreet murmurs, which, to him, sounded like direct judgments. The pain of his empty stomach urged him to keep going. Each step was a battle between his dignity and necessity. Giuseppe barely lifted his eyes, fearing the obvious disdain in the atmosphere. He knew his presence was unwelcome, but he had no other choice. Don't forget to leave a like and don't miss any details of this emotional story. Arriving at the counter, he placed his few coins on the surface. The owner of the establishment, Marcella, a middle-aged woman known for her cold temperament, looked him up and down with a disgusted expression. Her apron, once white, was stained with spilled coffee, but the look she gave Giuseppe was even more stained with prejudice. "I just wanted the cheapest sandwich, please," Giuseppe said in a hoarse voice, barely audible over the murmurs around him. His gnarled, dirty fingers fumbled with the coins, trying to project some confidence. Marcella crossed her arms, her expression stern. "This isn't a homeless shelter, old man," she said in a cutting tone that made Giuseppe shudder. "If you don't have money, don't eat." Feeling the weight of humiliation, Giuseppe took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Please, Jay, anything you can give me. I'm hungry." The plea was almost a whisper, but the desperation in his eyes was evident. The atmosphere around him felt even heavier. Some customers whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with his presence, but no one offered to help. "Do you think you can come in here and ask for free food?" Marcella retorted, leaning in close to Giuseppe, her voice dripping with contempt. "We don't have leftovers here. Go somewhere else." The murmurs turned into quiet laughter. A nearby customer shook his head with a sarcastic smile. "That's right. Get out of here, old man. We don't want your company." With tears in his eyes, Giuseppe froze. He didn't know whether to leave or insist a little more. His stomach growled and shame consumed him. He felt invisible, as if his entire life was being judged in that moment. The awkward silence that filled the space felt even heavier on him. He wanted to disappear, but his legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, when everything seemed lost and hope slipped away from his thoughts, the cafe door opened again. The entrance of an elegant, determined woman caught everyone's attention. Isabella, with her well-groomed brown hair and wearing a sharp suit, walked confidently through the room. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Without hesitation, Isabella approached the counter. The atmosphere changed immediately. Marcella, who moments earlier had displayed her arrogance, now seemed uncertain upon realizing the arrival of this influential woman. Isabella was not an ordinary customer. Known in the city for her luxury boutiques, her presence commanded respect. "What's the problem here?" Isabella asked, her voice firm and controlled but laden with disapproval. Her gaze fixed on Giuseppe, who was still motionless, trying to maintain the dignity he had left. Marcella attempted to regain her composure, but the entire cafe was waiting for the unfolding of this unexpected intervention. The tension in the air was palpable. Isabella looked at Giuseppe and, with a reassuring smile, extended her hand. "Don't worry, sir. Today your lunch is on me." Old Giuseppe looked at her in disbelief, his tear-filled eyes now shining with a glimmer of hope. Isabella turned her gaze to Marcella, who, still surprised by the interruption, was trying to maintain her authority. The tension that had previously existed between Giuseppe and Marcella was now directed entirely toward Isabella, who exuded a subtle yet undeniable strength. "I already said, this man cannot be served here," Marcella insisted defensively, trying to regain control of the situation. "This isn't a place for that kind of people." Isabella remained calm, but her eyes displayed an intensity that made Marcella hesitate. "That kind of people?" Isabella repeated, leaning slightly forward. "I believe we're talking about a human being, not a category, Marcella." The customers, who had been entertained by Giuseppe's humiliation, now watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The scene had shifted dramatically. Isabella, with her firm and determined posture, refused to back down. Giuseppe, who had kept his head down until then, raised his eyes toward the woman defending him. His trembling hands still clutched the few coins he had painstakingly gathered. He didn't know if he should say something, but the words were stuck in his throat, crushed by shame. "I will pay for anything he needs," Isabella said, turning her attention back to Giuseppe. "He has the same right to be here as any other customer." Her eyes moved over the faces around, challenging anyone to contradict her. Marcella, trying to regain control, scoffed. "We don't offer charity here. If he can't pay, he shouldn't be here. That's our business." "Business," Isabella interrupted, not changing her tone but with a slight ironic smile on her lips. "Businesses are made of people, Marcella, and you seem to have forgotten that." She took a step forward, moving even closer to the counter, now speaking for all to hear. "I've been a customer here for years, and I never imagined I would witness something so inhumane." The whispers among the customers stopped, and silence took over the place. Marcella was visibly flustered. She knew Isabella's reputation in the city was strong, and any confrontation could harm her image. However, her arrogance still kept her firm. "This isn't a charity center," Marcella said, crossing her arms as if that could strengthen her position. "If he doesn't have money, I can't help him." Isabella let out a brief laugh, but her eyes remained piercing. "You talk about charity, but you don't realize you're treating a person as if they were less than that. Charity is a choice. Humanity shouldn't be." Giuseppe, who had been silently observing, felt a whirlwind of emotions. It was rare for someone to intercede for him, especially with such fervor. The humiliation he had felt earlier began to dissolve into surprise. He never expected that anyone, let alone a distinguished woman like Isabella, would defend him. He could barely hold back the tears forming in his eyes. Noticing Giuseppe's shaken look, Isabella leaned slightly, speaking more softly. "Don, you can eat whatever you want today." She placed her hand over his, gently pushing the coins back. "Keep this. Don't worry about it." Marcella, feeling the embarrassment grow with each passing second, tried to wrap up the conversation. "Very well, ma'am. If that's what you want, so be it. But this won't happen again," she muttered, her pride still wounded. Isabella, undeterred, simply smiled lightly and responded calmly. "What won't happen again, Marcella, is how you treat people here, because I will make sure everyone knows how your business operates." Marcella froze, aware that her words could have consequences. Meanwhile, the other customers avoided direct involvement, but it was clear that many were now reconsidering what they had witnessed. Giuseppe, finally regaining some dignity, was led to a table by one of the staff, still under Isabella's watchful eye. She followed him with her gaze, feeling a mix of sadness and satisfaction. There was something about this man that stirred a deep empathy within her, a connection she couldn't quite explain. As Giuseppe settled into his chair, Isabella walked over and pulled out a chair for herself. "Now, sir, what would you like to eat? You're hungry, so let's take care of that." Her tone, once firm and challenging, was now warm and inviting. Giuseppe, unsure how to express his gratitude, murmured, "I don't know how to thank you, Mum." "What you're doing for me." Isabella smiled, shaking her head. "No need to thank me, Giuseppe. Let's just start with a good lunch and then we can talk." Isabella watched closely as the waiter, still somewhat reluctant, brought Giuseppe's plate. He placed the sandwich and a cup of coffee on the table, without showing enthusiasm. But under Isabella's stern gaze, he didn't dare say a word. Giuseppe looked at the plate in front of him, with a mix of surprise and gratitude. His fingers, still trembling, slowly reached for the bread but hesitated, as if he were waiting for it all to be a dream, ready to evaporate at any moment. "You can eat," Isabella encouraged, with a gentle smile that contrasted with her earlier firmness. "It's yours, you deserve it." Giuseppe nodded grateful, and took his first bite of the sandwich. The hunger seemed to dissolve all the shame and embarrassment he had felt just moments before. He chewed slowly, almost reverently, while Isabella watched him calmly, trying to process the strange feeling that filled her chest. It was a mix of compassion and something deeper, something that made her feel an inexplicable connection to this man. As Giuseppe ate, the cafe had returned to a state of forced normalcy. Marcella, still indignant about Isabella's intervention, had stepped away from the counter, speaking in hushed tones with the staff, and casting furtive glances toward the table where the two were seated. However, the atmosphere still carried a residue of the earlier tension, as if something more was yet to come. It was then that, as Isabella adjusted her bag on the table, something shimmered on Giuseppe's wrist. Her eyes caught the glint of an old watch. For a moment she didn't pay much attention, but soon something about the accessory drew her in. There was something incredibly familiar about the shape and style of the watch. She blinked a few times, as if trying to push away a distant memory that was starting to resurface. "Mr. Giuseppe," she said, her tone now tinged with curiosity, "may I see your watch?" Giuseppe, a bit confused, stopped eating and looked at his wrist, as if he had forgotten he was still wearing the accessory. "Oh, of course." He began to carefully unfasten the strap, and as he handed the watch to Isabella, he commented, "It's a keepsake from someone very important." Isabella took the watch in her hands, her fingers trembling. The cool texture of the metal took her back to memories she had locked away long ago. She turned the watch over to examine the back, and suddenly her heart raced. Engraved on the underside in delicate letters was a name that made her shudder: Emanuele. She brought a hand to her mouth in shock. That watch. It was the same one she had given as a gift many years ago, to the person who meant everything in her life. That watch belonged to Emanuele, the man she had loved and tragically lost. How had that object come to Giuseppe? "Where did you get this watch?" Isabella's voice trembled as she asked the question. She couldn't take her eyes off the object, as if it had reopened a wound she thought had healed. Giuseppe, sensing the emotion in Isabella's eyes, was confused for a moment. "It was a gift," he said hesitantly. "A gift from my son, Emanuele." His words hit Isabella like a blow. Her suspicions were correct. Giuseppe's son was the same Emanuele who had been her great love, the man whose death she mourned to this day. Her heart raced, and a mix of sadness, surprise, and longing flooded her chest. Giuseppe, not fully understanding her reaction, continued, "Emanuele, he passed away many years ago. After he left, life was never the same." Isabella felt tears begin to form in her eyes, but she fought to maintain her composure. The shock of the discovery was overwhelming. Emanuele had disappeared from her life so abruptly, and she never had the chance to say goodbye properly. Now, here was his father, a man shattered by the circumstances of life, holding the only object that connected her to her past. He was my... Isabella tried to find the words, but the emotions were choking her. Giuseppe, noticing her state, began to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. "You knew my son?" Giuseppe asked, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and pain. Isabella nodded, unable to speak immediately. She looked at Giuseppe with a blend of affection and sadness. "I loved him," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I loved him more than anything in this world." The silence that followed between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Giuseppe appeared shocked, unable to process what he had just heard. Isabella, on the other hand, held the watch tightly, as if fearing that this small piece of memory might be ripped away from her again. "Why didn't I ever know about you?" Giuseppe finally asked, his voice a blend of curiosity and sorrow. Isabella took a deep breath, preparing to revisit the wounds of her past. "It's a long story," she began, looking into the eyes of the man who suddenly seemed much more than just a needy stranger. "But now, I think we need to talk." Isabella held Emmanuel's watch carefully, as if it were made of fragile glass, capable of shattering at any moment. Every detail of the object transported her to a time she thought she had left behind. The worn shine, the discreet engraving underneath, and the way Emanuele used to twist it on his wrist while they talked. Everything came rushing back like an avalanche, overwhelming her emotions and bringing her back to those days she would never forget. Giuseppe watched her, his eyes watery from a confusion that was beginning to dissolve into understanding. He recognized that look, the look of someone who had deeply loved his son, someone who felt the same pain he had carried since Emanuele's loss. The connection between them was undeniable. "He never mentioned you," Giuseppe said, his voice hoarse and low. He seemed reluctant, as if unsure whether he was ready to hear what Isabella had to say, but at the same time, he felt he needed to know. Isabella sighed, still holding the watch between her fingers. "I don't know where to begin," she said with a melancholic tone, her heart heavy with memories. "I met Emanuele when we were young. I worked in a boutique, my first opportunity in the city. He used to come by with donations for the orphanage where I had grown up, and that's how we got close." Giuseppe's eyes widened. "Orphanage?" She nodded slowly, her eyes glazed over with memories. "Yes. I was raised there since I was a child. I wasn't fortunate enough to know my parents, but the orphanage became my home, and it was there that I met Emanuele. He was always kind, devoted, so full of life. We had many plans together, plans for the future, until fate changed everything." Giuseppe fell silent, absorbing every word. Isabella's pain reflected his own, but now, hearing her story, he realized there was a part of Emanuele's life he had never known, a side of his son he lost before he could fully understand. His heart tightened with longing, but also with gratitude for finding someone who shared that love. "I never knew about that part of his life," Giuseppe murmured, lowering his head. "After Emanuele died, Victoria, my wife, always blamed someone. She would say he distanced himself because of a woman, but she never told me the details. All I knew was that after his death nothing was the same." Isabella shuddered at the mention of Victoria, Emanuele's mother. She didn't need any explanations to know who Giuseppe was talking about. She vaguely remembered distant and tense encounters with that stern woman, whose expectations were unattainable, and whose approval was never granted. "Victoria never accepted me," Isabella said, her voice trembling. "She never thought I was good enough for her son, and that created a chasm between Emanuele and his family. He was torn between us, trying to be the perfect son, while wanting to live his own life. It was a very difficult time." Giuseppe looked up, visibly moved. He hadn't realized how heavy the burden his son carried had been. He never fully understood the conflict that had pulled Emanuele away from the family. Victoria had convinced him that the blame lay with the girl he loved. But now, sitting across from Isabella, he saw that the suffering had been much deeper and more complex than he had imagined. "He never stopped visiting me, but—" "It was rare," Giuseppe said with a long, tired sigh. "And then, when the accident happened," Isabella felt a knot tighten in her throat. The moment she had dreaded hearing was approaching, the point where everything fell apart. Giuseppe continued, his voice growing weaker. "That day, it was so fast. Emanuele was with her, and I never knew exactly what happened. He was gone, and the only thing that remained was this watch." His eyes fixed on the accessory in Isabella's hands, as if it were the last physical connection he had with his son. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back her tears. She had been there that day, the day of the accident, the day everything changed. The memory was an open wound that never fully healed. "I was with him," she confessed, finally breaking the silence. "We were heading to a friend's house together, but we never arrived. There was an accident. It all happened so fast. When I woke up, he was already gone." The tears she had been holding back finally fell, and she covered her face with her hands, allowing herself to sink into the pain of that moment. Giuseppe watched her, equally moved, his own tears silently streaming down the wrinkles of his weary face. "I never knew," Giuseppe whispered, his voice broken by pain and regret. "I never knew you were with him." Isabella shook her head, trying to control her emotion. "I loved him with all my heart," she said, "and I lost everything that day." She had tried to move on, but the past had always lurked, while Giuseppe had sunk deeper into sadness and regret, until his life was reduced to what she saw now, an old, tired man trying to survive the ruins of his losses. "I can't believe it," Giuseppe murmured, shaking his head slowly. "You were the woman he loved, and I never knew how much that meant to him." Isabella quickly wiped her tears, struggling to maintain her composure. "I didn't know he was your son until now. But seeing the watch, it all came back, all the memories. He always wore this watch, the gift I gave him when we started making plans for the future." She looked at Giuseppe, who seemed lost in his own thoughts, his eyes fixed on the past. "He spoke little about you," Giuseppe continued almost in a whisper, "but I knew something was pulling him away from us. Victoria, my wife. She never accepted the idea of Emanuele being with someone not from our level. She always wanted him to marry someone from society, someone who could elevate our position." His voice trembled, full of guilt and sadness. Isabella nodded, understanding perfectly. "She hated me. Whenever I tried to get close, I felt her disdain. And Emanuele, trying to please everyone, was caught between two realities. He was a good man, Giuseppe. He wanted to make everyone happy, but it tore him apart." Giuseppe took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly on the table. "I never imagined it would be this way. After he was gone, Victoria and I grew even further apart. She blamed herself, and deep down, I think she blamed me too. That's when everything started to crumble." Isabella looked at Giuseppe with deep empathy. "And how did you end up here?" she asked softly, as if each word needed to be carefully chosen to avoid reopening wounds. Giuseppe let out a deep sigh, the weight of his story making his shoulders slump even more. "After Emanuele died, she was never the same. She sank into grief, and I lost my footing too. Our marriage couldn't withstand it. The guilt and mourning drove us apart, and I ended up distancing myself from everything. We had a comfortable life, but the emptiness he left was unbearable." "Victoria always blamed me," Giuseppe said, his voice choked. "She would say that if I had been firmer with Emanuele, he would have chosen another path, stayed away from you. And I, in my weakness, believed for a long time that she was right." Hearing this, Isabella felt a heavy weight in her chest. It wasn't easy for her to hear that Victoria saw her as the reason for the family's collapse. "Giuseppe," she said gently, "it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Sometimes, life takes us down paths we can't foresee or control. What happened was an accident. But the love Emanuele had for you and for me, that love was real. None of this can be diminished by accusations. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel." Giuseppe looked at Isabella with tear-filled eyes, clearly touched by her words. "I never thought I would meet you one day, that I would discover who the woman my son loved truly was. It means so much to me." Isabella reached out over the table, lightly touching Giuseppe's hand. "We both share the same loss, and somehow, that connects us. I don't know why fate brought us here today, but I know we're together now, and maybe that means something greater." They fell silent for a few moments, processing the revelations and the feelings that accompanied them. Emanuele's watch was still in Isabella's hands, and she carefully returned it to Giuseppe, who placed it back on his wrist with a solemn look. "This watch," Isabella said, her voice soft, "is more than an accessory. It's a symbol of the time we spent with him, of what we shared. And as painful as it is, it also reminds me that time continues to pass, and that we need to find ways to move forward." Giuseppe smiled sadly, understanding the depth of those words. "I don't know how to move on," he admitted sincerely. "After we lost everything, Victoria and I, We ended up on the streets. And now we're just surviving. Isabella felt a wave of empathy so strong that it made her shift in her chair. And where is Victoria now? She asked, her heart tightening. Giuseppe lowered his head. She's waiting for me in a nearby square. We have nowhere to go and well, she's even more broken than I am. Isabella took a deep breath, sensing that there was something greater to be done. I want to see Victoria, she said firmly. I want to help both of you. I can't change the past, but I can try to improve the future. Isabella's heart raced as she walked alongside Giuseppe through the bustling streets of the city. The words they had exchanged in the cafe still echoed in her mind. The father of the man she had loved was at her side. And now, about to meet the woman who had always despised her, Isabella knew the moment would be difficult. But something inside her told her this was the right step to take. Giuseppe guided her in silence, his steps slow and weary, as if the weight of the years and hardships had drained all the energy he once had. Isabella's eyes wandered through the city, but her mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts. Reuniting with Victoria was something she had never imagined. The memories of Emanuele's mother made her tremble, but she knew she had to face it. Finally, after a few minutes, they arrived at a small square hidden between old buildings. It was a tranquil but worn place, where a few people sat on benches or strolled leisurely. And there, under the shade of a large tree, sat Victoria. The contrast between the woman Isabella had known in the past and the fragile figure sitting in the shade was shocking. Victoria, once proud and immaculate, was now hunched over, wrapped in an old tattered coat, her gray hair carelessly tied back. Her eyes, once filled with pride, were now dull, staring into nothing as she held a small bag beside her. Giuseppe approached carefully, as if fearing to awaken a sleeping beast. Isabella followed closely, her heart in her throat. When they got close enough, Victoria lifted her eyes with an expression of exhaustion that quickly turned to surprise and distrust upon seeing a stranger next to her husband. "Giuseppe," Victoria murmured, her voice hoarse and weakened. "Who is this woman?" Giuseppe hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Victoria, this is Isabella. She was someone important to Emanuele." The name Emanuele fell between them like a stone thrown into a still lake, creating ripples of tension and repressed emotions. Victoria's eyes widened upon hearing the name, and she immediately recognized who stood before her. "Isabella," Victoria said, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. You are the woman who took him away from us, the cause of all our misery." The accusation was strong and cutting, and Isabella felt the impact of those words like daggers, but she took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. She knew that for there to be any chance of reconciliation, she would need to be patient. "Victoria, I understand that you see me this way," Isabella said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm here to help. We can't change what happened in the past, but perhaps we can find a way to move forward." Victoria shook her head, her hands trembling as she gripped the bag tighter. You don't understand. I lost everything. Everything, my sons, our life. Nothing makes sense anymore." Isabella felt a tightness in her chest, seeing the raw pain in Victoria's eyes. There was no denying that this woman was completely devastated by Emanuele's loss. Giuseppe knelt beside Victoria, holding her hands gently. "Dear, I know you've suffered. I have too. But we found Isabella by chance today, and she's willing to help us. Perhaps it's time to stop running from the past." Victoria looked from Giuseppe to Isabella, her expressions mixing confusion and pain. "Why now?" Victoria asked, narrowing her eyes as if searching for a hidden motive in Isabella's intentions. "Why, after everything we've been through, would you show up to help us? You owe us nothing." Isabella stepped forward, kneeling beside Giuseppe to be at Victoria's level. Her eyes were filled with compassion, and her voice was soft but heavy with emotion. "I loved Emanuele. And that is something that, I know we've lost so much, but I'm here to try to do something he would have wanted. He taught me to forgive, to care for others, and I believe that wherever he is, he would want me to reach out to you." Victoria was silent for a long moment, and the gentle wind passing through the trees seemed to be the only thing moving in that square. Isabella could see the internal battle in Victoria's eyes, a struggle between wounded pride and the desire to finally let the past rest. Finally, Victoria sighed, a long, tired breath, as if she were releasing years of accumulated tension. "I don't know what to say." Giuseppe squeezed her hands gently. "Just say you'll accept help, Victoria. We've lived this way for so long. Maybe it's time to change that." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time she allowed a bit of the rigidity in her body to dissolve. "I don't know if I can trust again." "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Isabella said with an encouraging smile. "But let me try to help. Let's take it one step at a time. I have space in my home. You can stay with me until we find a better solution." Victoria looked at Giuseppe, who was gazing at her with hope and tenderness. Then finally she nodded, allowing the tears to fall. "I accept." Isabella smiled, and in that moment, something began to change. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in years, Isabella felt they were all moving toward healing. The first rays of morning light illuminated the small living room of Isabella's home. Giuseppe and Victoria had settled there the night before, still uncertain and cautious about the drastic change in their lives. Isabella's home was cozy and modern, with elegant furniture that reflected her prosperous life, contrasting sharply with the harsh reality that Giuseppe and Victoria had faced on the streets. Isabella, sitting in an armchair beside a large window, watched the sun rise, holding a hot cup of coffee in her hands. Her thoughts were tangled. The presence of Giuseppe and Victoria in her home represented much more than just an act of charity. It was an attempt to heal old wounds, to forgive, and perhaps to find a path to peace. Victoria appeared at the door, hesitating, still adjusting to the idea of being under Isabella's roof. There was something disarming about seeing that once proud and fierce woman, now so fragile, with her shoulders hunched under the weight of years and sorrows. Her eyes were tired, but there was something new in them, perhaps a spark of hope. "You're up early," Isabella said with a slight smile, motioning to the sofa beside her. "Would you like some coffee?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, as if still pondering whether to accept the kindness, but eventually sat down slowly on the sofa. "Yes, I'd like some. Thank you." Isabella poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Victoria, who held it with both hands, letting the warmth soothe her cold fingers. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. "I still can't believe I'm here," Victoria said, almost to herself, looking at the coffee in her hands. "If someone had told me years ago that one day I would accept your help, I would have laughed in their face." Isabella smiled, understanding. "I get it. And to be honest, I never imagined we'd be here together, after everything that happened." Victoria took a deep breath, as if preparing for a difficult confession. "I never looked at you favorably, Isabella. When Emanuele first spoke of you, I immediately knew you were different from what I expected for him. I always wanted the best for my son, and I thought that meant he needed to be with someone who could help him rise in life." Isabella remained silent, allowing Victoria to open up at her own pace. "But now I see how wrong I was," Victoria continued, her voice trembling. "I lost my son, lost my life, and I blamed you for so long. I blamed you for taking Emanuele away from us, for being the reason for all our misfortunes. But the truth is, what happened was much bigger than any of us." Isabella felt a knot tighten in her throat. Victoria's confession was something she had never imagined hearing. "I never wanted to take him away from you," she said softly. "I loved Emanuele, but I know he loved you both too. The decision to distance himself wasn't easy for him. He always wanted to please everyone." Victoria nodded, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I was blinded by pain and pride. For years I fed that resentment, and it destroyed us. Not just me, but Giuseppe too. When Emanuele left, I lost my footing. And now, so many years later, I see that you weren't to blame. I just didn't know how to cope with the loss." Isabella felt her own tears welling up. Those words, heavy with regret and sadness, pierced through the walls she had built around her heart. "We've all lost, Victoria. I lost the love of my life and you lost your son. We both suffered in different ways, but neither of us came out unscathed from this." Victoria quickly wiped her tears, trying to maintain the little dignity she had left. "I don't know how to thank you for helping us now, after everything I put you through." Isabella looked at her with compassion. "I don't want thanks, Victoria. What I want is for all of us to find some peace. Guilt and resentment have eaten away at us for too long. I think it's time we let that go, if not for ourselves, then for Emanuele." Victoria smiled, a small and timid smile but genuine. "He would be happy to see this, wouldn't he?" Isabella nodded, her eyes misty. "Yes, he would." At that moment Giuseppe appeared in the room, interrupting the delicate conversation, but bringing with him a different energy. He seemed more relaxed, as if the simple fact of having a roof over his head and a comfortable bed to sleep in had renewed him. "You two are here talking?" he asked, a light smile on his lips. "I think that's a good sign." Victoria and Isabella exchanged glances and laughed softly. "Yes, Giuseppe, we're talking," Isabella replied, waving at him. "I think we're starting to put the past in its place." Giuseppe sighed in relief and sat down beside Victoria, gently taking her hand. "I always knew that what we had wasn't living. After we lost everything, the pain swallowed us. But now, maybe we can have a second chance." Isabella looked at the couple with a renewed sense of hope. "You have a place here for as long as you need, but I hope that with time we can find something more permanent for you. You deserve a fresh start." Victoria squeezed Giuseppe's hand, and a shy smile formed on her lips. "Thank you, Isabella. Maybe this is our chance to finally let Emanuele rest in peace." Time passed quickly after that morning of reconciliation, and Giuseppe and Victoria began to adjust to their new life in Isabella's home. The atmosphere, once heavy with unspoken grievances and hurts, was now filled with a sense of peace that they had long forgotten. Isabella dedicated herself to providing the best for them, offering not just a roof, but also a new perspective on life. The transformation wasn't immediate, but gradually, the presence of human warmth and empathy began to heal their deepest wounds. One afternoon, while Isabella was organizing papers in the living room, Giuseppe walked in slowly and sat beside her. His gaze seemed distant, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "Isabella," he began, "I've been thinking a lot. I don't want you to feel like we're taking advantage of your generosity. I know Victoria and I have been living here for some time, and I'm immensely grateful for everything you've done for us. But I think it's time for us to start looking for something more permanent." Isabella looked at him in surprise but also with admiration. "Giuseppe, you're not taking advantage of anything. I'm doing this because I want to help, and because I know that in a way it helps me move forward too. But I understand what you're saying. You feel the need for something of your own, right?" Giuseppe nodded slowly. "Exactly. I think it's time for us to try to build something for ourselves again. Maybe something simple but that we can call home." Isabella smiled, touched by Giuseppe's honesty and desire to rebuild his life. "I think that's wonderful, and you don't have to do it alone. I want to continue helping, but now in a different way. We can look for a place together, something comfortable where you can start anew, with dignity." Giuseppe looked at her, visibly moved. "I don't know how to thank you enough for all of this. After so long on the streets, I thought I'd never have the chance to have something like a normal life again." "You deserve this new chance," Isabella replied tenderly. "And so does Victoria. I'm so happy you're ready to take this next step." As they spoke, Victoria appeared in the room, curious about what was happening. Noticing the topic, she approached, still hesitant. "Are you talking about leaving here?" she asked, looking from Giuseppe to Isabella. "Yes," Isabella said with an encouraging smile. "Giuseppe mentioned that you are ready to look for a place of your own. I think it's an excellent idea. Are you ready for that?" Victoria sighed as if the idea was both frightening and liberating. I don't know," she admitted. "Here, I feel safe. After everything we've been through, the idea of going out again makes me nervous." Isabella stepped closer and firmly but gently held Victoria's hands. "I understand, and no one is saying this has to happen immediately. We can take it at your pace, whenever you feel ready. The important thing is that you know you will always have a home wherever you are, and I will always be here to help." Victoria looked at Giuseppe, who was gazing at her with an encouraging look, as if saying they could finally move forward. She took a deep breath before slowly nodding. Maybe it's time to start over. But I want to do it knowing we're not alone." "You will never be alone," Isabella assured her. "This is a journey we will take together." In the days that followed, Isabella dedicated herself to helping the couple find a new home. They consulted real estate listings, visited different neighborhoods, and after a few weeks they found a small house, simple but welcoming. It was located in a quiet neighborhood near a park where Giuseppe and Victoria could stroll and perhaps begin their lives anew with some normalcy. When the house was chosen, Isabella helped organize the move and ensured everything was ready to welcome them. The first night in the new home was exciting for everyone. Giuseppe and Victoria, despite their nervousness, were happy to be able to call that place home. The small living room with its simple furniture and soft light symbolized a new beginning. That night, as Isabella said goodbye to the couple in front of their new home, Giuseppe warmly embraced her. "You've given us something we can never repay, Isabella. The chance to be a family again." Isabella smiled, moved. "You don't need to repay me. Just live this new life with all the love and gratitude in your hearts. That's more than enough." Victoria, who had previously hesitated to show her feelings, stepped forward and hugged Isabella tightly as well. "I never thought I could forgive or move on, but now I see that forgiveness sets us free, and I'm grateful for you giving us this chance. We're all healing together," Isabella said, looking at both of them with an affectionate smile. "And Emanuele would be happy to see this." As Isabella stepped away, leaving Giuseppe and Victoria on the threshold of their new home, she felt a lightness in her heart. The past had been painful, but finally, they were all finding a way to peace. A few weeks passed since Giuseppe and Victoria moved into their new home. The adjustment process was slow, but the couple began to create a new routine. The simplicity of life in that small home brought a tranquility they hadn't experienced in a long time. The walks in the park, the conversations at the dinner table, and the small moments of shared silence were a balm for their souls. Isabella visited them often, always attentive to ensure they lacked nothing. The visits, which had started as short and formal, now became long and relaxed. They laughed together, shared stories, and talked about the future. Isabella had not only helped them find a new physical home, but also an emotional one, a place where forgiveness and love could flourish. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, Isabella decided to do something special. She invited Giuseppe and Victoria to spend the day at her house. She had a surprise planned, something that could further strengthen the bonds they had built. When the couple arrived at Isabella's home, they were greeted with a warm smile and the aroma of a delicious lunch prepared with care. The atmosphere was light, and the sunlight streaming through the windows brought a sense of renewal. "You've come on the perfect day," Isabella said, guiding them to the dining room. "I have a surprise." Giuseppe and Victoria exchanged curious glances, confident that whatever Isabella had prepared would be meaningful. They sat at the table, admiring the arrangement of the dishes and the simple yet elegant decor. Before they could ask, the door to the living room opened, and a tall, smiling young man walked in. Isabella immediately stood up and walked toward him, her eyes shining with pride. "Giuseppe, Victoria, I want you to meet Esteban, my son," Isabella said, her voice filled with emotion. "He just returned from university and was eager to meet you." Victoria's face lit up, and Giuseppe's eyes sparkled with genuine joy. Esteban approached the table, extending his hand to greet them. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Esteban said with a warm smile, shaking Giuseppe's hand and giving a gentle hug to Victoria, who welcomed him with a tender look. "You look a lot like your mother," Giuseppe commented, with a light laugh. "And it's clear she raised you well." Isabella watched the scene with a heart full of gratitude. This was more than just a family gathering. It was the consolidation of a new beginning, an expansion of the circle of love and forgiveness she had been carefully building. She knew that, in a way, Esteban's presence symbolized the continuation of Emanuele's legacy. He never had the chance to know their son, but now Giuseppe and Victoria were meeting Isabella's son, a part of her life that represented the future. During lunch, the conversations flowed easily. Giuseppe and Vittoria, who once carried the weight of years of pain and suffering, seemed renewed. After the meal, Isabella suggested that everyone go to the garden for coffee. Esteban, attentive and careful, helped Giuseppe walk to the outdoor area, while Vittoria and Isabella chatted happily about the flowers lining the path. Sitting outside with the sun setting in the background, the atmosphere was one of pure serenity. Isabella looked around, and for a moment everything seemed to be exactly as it should be. "I never thought I could have something like this again," Vittoria said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The feeling of family, of belonging. I thought those things had died with Emanuele." Isabella gently held her hand. "We're rebuilding this together, Vittoria. And now we have a new chance to create good memories, to live more lightly." Giuseppe, who had been gazing at the horizon, spoke softly. "You know, Emanuele left us much more than we realized. Even in his absence he continues to unite us. I feel that somehow he is here, present, seeing that we've finally found peace." Esteban, who had been listening attentively, leaned in and spoke with calm wisdom. "I believe that a person's legacy never completely disappears. Emanuele was an important part of all your lives, but now you are all part of my story, my life, and I'm very happy about that." Vittoria smiled, a tear rolling down her cheek, but this time it wasn't one of sadness. "You're very kind, Esteban. I think in some way, we're all connected by something greater." The rest of the afternoon was filled with deep conversations, laughter, and a feeling of reconciliation that hung in the air. As evening began to fall, Isabella took them back to their new home, and Giuseppe and Vittoria said goodbye with warm hugs, promising that this wouldn't be the last time they all gathered. As Isabella walked home with Esteban, she felt that finally the cycle of pain and mourning was closing. The past would always be part of their lives, but the future now seemed brighter than ever. After months of pain and overcoming, Isabella, Giuseppe, Vittoria, and Esteban found the peace and love they had long sought. Each of them, marked by the past, learned to forgive and move forward, united by bonds deeper than blood. Isabella, who had carried the burden of losing Emanuele, now felt gratitude and serenity. Giuseppe and Vittoria, once consumed by grief, rediscovered the joy of simple living and shared love. Esteban, with his youth and generosity, brought hope and continuity to his. In the end, they became a new family, reborn through forgiveness and unity. Together they built a home filled with love and hope, ready to face the future with strength, knowing that the past, though painful, no longer defined them. Love and forgiveness transformed them, allowing them to find a new beginning, full of light and possibilities. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to be the first to receive the next video. Share with your friends, and check out the video on the end screen. You'll be moved.